On a forgotten stretch of highway, a widow driving through her grief encounters two elderly strangers carrying something impossible. What begins as a simple act of kindness unravels into a journey that will shatter everything she believes about loss, time, and the invisible threads that bind us to those we've loved. Some encounters aren't accidents. Some roads lead exactly where we need to go, even when we don't know we're lost. Stay until the end. This story will change how you see the world. If this story touches you, give it a like and subscribe for more narratives that awaken the soul. The rain had stopped 3 hours ago, but the sky refused to let go of its gray. Margaret drove with both hands on the wheel, though the highway stretched empty in every direction, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through farmland that had surrendered to autumn. The radio played nothing but static between towns, and she had stopped trying to find music 2 counties back. Silence had become her companion these past 8 months, ever since the funeral, ever since the house had learned to echo with only one set of footsteps. She had grown accustomed to the weight of it, the way it pressed against her chest in the morning and followed her through rooms that suddenly seemed too large, filled with furniture that had witnessed a marriage of 37 years and now served no purpose but to gather dust and memories she could not bear to touch. The highway curved gently through hills that rolled like frozen waves, their surfaces covered in dying grass that bent beneath a wind she could not hear through the sealed windows of her car. She had left the city with no particular destination, only the vague notion that movement might feel like progress, that putting miles between herself and the emptiness of her kitchen table might somehow create distance from grief itself. It was a foolish hope, she knew, the kind of magical thinking that belonged to children who believed that closing their eyes made monsters disappear. But she had tried everything else. The support groups with their circle of folding chairs and practiced empathy, the books with their stages and timelines, the well-meaning friends who had stopped calling when she could no longer pretend to be healing at the pace they expected. So she drove, watching the mile markers count upward, each number a small achievement that meant nothing at all. The sun hung low behind the clouds, a pale disk that cast no shadows, and Margaret found herself thinking about light, about how Thomas had loved the golden hour, that brief window before sunset when everything glowed as if lit from within. He had been a photographer once, before the practical demands of marriage and mortgage had turned his passion into a weekend hobby, and then into something he mentioned wistfully over dinner, and then into silence. She wondered now, with the particular cruelty of hindsight, whether he had minded, whether the slow death of his dreams had felt like a betrayal she had participated in without noticing. They had been so young when they married, so certain that love was enough, that everything else would simply arrange itself around the fact of their devotion. And perhaps it had, in its way, but the arrangement had required sacrifices neither of them had named, compromises that became invisible through repetition until they were simply the architecture of their life together. A sign appeared on the right shoulder, weathered and tilting slightly, announcing a rest stop in 2 miles. Margaret's back ached from 4 hours of driving, and her bladder had been sending gentle reminders for the past 30 minutes. So she signaled even though there were no other cars to see the gesture, even though the habit of signaling felt absurd on this empty stretch of road. But habits were what remained when everything else fell away, she had learned. Habits were the skeleton that kept you upright when grief tried to dissolve you into nothing. Brush your teeth. Make the bed. Signal before turning. Small rituals that prove you still existed, that you were still a person capable of moving through the world with intention, even if that intention led nowhere in particular. The rest stop materialized slowly, a small parking area with concrete picnic tables and a cinder-block bathroom that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and forgotten immediately afterward. Margaret pulled into a space near the entrance, the tires crunching over gravel embedded with bottle caps and the silver pull tabs from soda cans that had been obsolete for decades. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, watching leaves skitter across the pavement like small, frightened animals fleeing something she could not see. The air smelled of rain and decay. When she finally opened the door, that particular scent of autumn that was really the smell of things dying beautifully, making peace with their own ending. And it was then, as she stood and stretched and felt her spine crack in three distinct places, that she saw them at the far end of the parking lot. Two elderly figures standing at the edge of the woods, motionless as statues, waiting for something or someone with a patience that seemed to exist outside of time itself. They were holding something between them, though from this distance Margaret could not discern what it was. The figures appeared to be a man and a woman, both bent with age, dressed in clothes that seemed too formal for a highway rest stop, too deliberate for an accidental encounter. The woman wore a dark coat that fell to her ankles, and the man's hat sat perfectly level on his head, despite the wind that was now picking up, sending more leaves into their small cyclones of motion. Margaret felt an inexplicable pull toward them, a tug beneath her sternum that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with recognition, though she was certain she had never seen these people before in her life. She closed her car door with a soft click and began walking in their direction, not consciously deciding to approach them, but finding her feet carrying her forward anyway, as if her body understood something her mind had not yet grasped. The distance between them contracted slowly, and with each step Margaret noticed new details that deepened the strangeness of the scene. The elderly couple did not acknowledge her approach, did not turn their heads or shift their posture, but remained fixed in their position as if they were part of the landscape itself, as essential and immovable as the trees behind them. The object they held between them resolved gradually into clarity, a wooden frame, perhaps 2 feet by 3 feet, containing what appeared to be a mirror, though the surface seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it, a darkness that was somehow deeper than mere shadow. Margaret stopped approximately 10 feet away, suddenly uncertain, feeling as though she had interrupted something sacred, a ritual she had no right to witness. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sounding thin and apologetic in the open air. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman turned first, slowly, as if movement required great effort or great consideration. Her face was a landscape of wrinkles, each line a story, each fold containing decades. But her eyes were startling in their clarity, pale blue and sharp, the kind of eyes that seemed to perceive more than the surface of things, that looked through you to whatever truth you were hiding from yourself. She smiled, and the smile was gentle but also knowing, the expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this moment, who had perhaps been waiting years for this specific encounter on this specific afternoon. "We're quite all right, dear," the woman said, her voice carrying an accent Margaret could not place. Something European perhaps, or simply old-fashioned, the kind of pronunciation that had fallen out of use decades ago. "Though I suspect you might not be. Loss sits on you like a heavy coat, doesn't it? One you cannot seem to take off, no matter how it weighs you down." Margaret felt her breath catch, felt the automatic defensiveness rising in her chest, the modern instinct to protect one's private pain from strangers who had no right to name it. But something in the woman's expression disarmed her, a compassion so complete it left no room for offense. "My husband died," Margaret heard herself say, the words emerging without her permission, as if they had been waiting just behind her teeth for 8 months, looking for any opening to escape. 8 months ago. I don't know how to. Time is not the medicine they claim it is," the old man said, speaking for the first time. His voice was deeper than she expected, resonant, the kind of voice that belonged to radio announcers from a bygone era. He had not turned to face her, keeping his attention on the dark mirror between them. But she could see his profile now, the noble slope of his nose, the silver bristle of his beard catching what little light the overcast sky provided. "Time does not heal. It merely teaches us to carry what cannot be set down." The weight remains the same, but our backs grow stronger or they break entirely. There is no third option. Margaret moved closer, drawn by something she could not name. Some frequency these strange people were transmitting that resonated with a part of her she had forgotten existed. "What is that?" she asked, gesturing toward the frame they held with such reverence. "What are you doing out here?" The woman glanced at her companion, and some wordless communication passed between them, a conversation conducted entirely through the subtle architecture of expression. Then she looked back at Margaret with those penetrating eyes that seemed to hold centuries rather than mere decades. "We are holding what must be held," she said simply. "We are doing what must be done, as we have done for longer than you might believe possible. But perhaps the better question is not what we are doing, but what you are doing here on this road, at this hour, when you should be anywhere else." "I'm just driving," Margaret said, feeling defensive again, feeling seen in ways that made her want to retreat to the safety of her car, to the comfortable isolation of the highway. "I needed to get away from the house. Everything there reminds me of him. I just needed to move." "Movement is not the same as progress," the old man said, still not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the dark mirror, as if it might at any moment reveal something crucial. "You can drive from here to the ocean and back again. You can cross every state and memorize every highway, and you will arrive nowhere closer to where you need to be. Because the place you need to reach is not a location. It is a state of understanding. It is a doorway you must walk through, and that doorway is always exactly where you're standing, though most people spend their entire lives refusing to see it." Margaret felt irritation flickering now, mixing with her confusion. "I don't understand what you're talking about. I stopped because I thought you might need help. If you're all right, then I should." "Look into the mirror," the woman interrupted, her voice still gentle, but now carrying an undertone of urgency. "Just for a moment. Look into it and tell us what you see." "I don't want to look at myself right now," Margaret said, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice, by the truth of it. She had been avoiding mirrors for months, unable to confront the stranger her face had become, the new lines, the permanent sadness in her eyes, the woman who was a widow when she had been a wife just 8 months ago. "We are not asking you to look at yourself," the old man said, and now he did turn to face her, and his eyes were the same pale blue as the woman's, the same impossible clarity. "We are asking you to look at what is. There is a difference, though most people never learn to distinguish between the two. Your reflection is just light and glass. But this," he lifted the frame slightly, and Margaret heard the woman grunt softly with the effort of supporting her end. "This shows what lies beneath the surface. This shows what is hidden, and I believe it has something to show you. Otherwise, you would not be here. We do not appear for those who are not ready to see." Margaret stood very still, feeling the wind push against her back, feeling the cold seeping through her jacket. Everything about this encounter felt impossible, felt like the kind of thing that happened in stories, but never in the actual world of rest stops and interstate highways and grief that crush you slowly, day after day, with its ordinary weight. But she had stopped believing in the boundaries of the ordinary 8 months ago, when Thomas had kissed her goodbye that Tuesday morning and gone to work and collapsed at his desk from an aneurysm no one had known was lurking in his brain like a time bomb set before he was born. Death had revealed itself to be arbitrary, sudden, uninterested in fairness or preparation. So why should strangeness be any less possible? Why should two elderly strangers holding a dark mirror on an empty highway be any more unlikely than a husband vanishing between breakfast and lunch, leaving behind only voicemails she could not bring herself to delete? "What will I see?" she asked quietly, taking one step closer, then another, until she stood directly before the frame, close enough to see that what she had taken for darkness was actually movement, a constant subtle shifting like smoke or water, like something alive. "We cannot tell you that," the woman said. "The mirror shows each person something different. It shows what needs to be seen, not what we want to see. And once you look, you cannot unlook. Once you know, you carry that knowing forward. So I will ask you only once more. Do you want to see what is hidden? Do you want to see what lies beneath the surface of your grief? Margaret thought of her empty house, of the bed she still slept on the left side of, leaving the right side undisturbed out of habit and heartbreak. She thought of the photographs she had turned face down because looking at Thomas smiling made her want to claw her own skin off. She thought of the future stretching ahead of her like a desert, empty and trackless, offering nothing but more of the same endless absence. What did she have to lose? What was there left to protect by refusing to see? Yes, she whispered. Show me. The old man and woman adjusted their grip on the frame, lifting it higher, angling it so that Margaret could look directly into its depths without bending. And she looked. She looked into the darkness that was not darkness, into the shifting surface that seemed to pull at her vision, drawing her in deeper and deeper, until she forgot about the rest stop, forgot about the elderly strangers, forgot about everything except what the mirror was revealing to her with terrible, beautiful clarity. At first, she saw nothing but the movement itself, the constant churning like storm clouds compressed into a small space. Then the movement began to coalesce, to take shape, and she realized she was looking at her kitchen, her actual kitchen, the one in the house she had left 3 hours ago. But it was not empty. Thomas sat at the table, exactly where he always sat, in the chair that faced the window overlooking the backyard. He was drinking coffee from his favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle that she had threatened to throw away 100 times, but never did. He was reading the newspaper, a ritual he had maintained even as the world moved online, insisting that there was something irreplaceable about the physical experience of turning pages, of the ink that came off on your fingers. Margaret felt her throat close, felt tears burning in her eyes. It was him, exactly as she remembered, down to the way he held his coffee mug with both hands, warming his palms even though the liquid had probably gone lukewarm hours ago. He was alive in the mirror, present and real, and she wanted to reach through the surface and touch him, wanted to step into that image and never return to this rest stop, to this reality where he was gone and she was left behind. But then she noticed something that made her breath catch for a different reason. She was there too, in the mirror, standing in the kitchen doorway. But this version of herself was not the version she had become in the past 8 months. This Margaret moved through the kitchen without heaviness, without the weight of grief crushing her spine. This Margaret smiled at Thomas as she passed, touched his shoulder briefly, casually, the kind of unconscious affection that belonged to people who took each other's presence for granted, who assumed there would always be tomorrow. And then she understood. She was not looking at the past. She was looking at what might have been, at the life that should have continued, the ordinary morning that should have been followed by 1,000 other ordinary mornings, each one building on the last, accumulating into a shared history that stretched toward old age and grandchildren, and finally, eventually, an ending that came for both of them when they were ready, when they had said everything that needed to be said. She was looking at the life that death had stolen, the future that had been erased in a single moment when blood vessels failed and Thomas fell forward onto his keyboard, and everything stopped. The scene in the mirror began to shift, the kitchen dissolving, and Margaret wanted to cry out, wanted to beg it to stay, but her voice would not work. A new image formed, sharper now, more insistent. She saw herself in their bedroom, standing before the closet where Thomas's clothes still hung exactly as he had left them. She watched herself reach for his jacket, the brown leather one he had worn for 15 years, refusing to replace it even when the elbows wore through, because he loved how it had shaped itself to his body. The Margaret in the mirror pressed the jacket to her face, inhaling deeply, searching for his scent, and Margaret, watching, could feel the devastation of that moment, the way the smell was already fading, the way time was slowly erasing even the physical evidence of his existence. But then something else appeared in the mirror, something impossible. A figure materialized beside the grieving Margaret, translucent but visible, present but not quite solid. It was Thomas, or rather, something that carried his shape, his essence. He stood beside his widow, not touching her, but close enough that they occupied the same space, the same moment. And though his form flickered like a candle flame in wind, though he was clearly not there in the way solid things are there, he was not absent either. He existed in some in-between state, some liminal space between presence and absence, between life and whatever came after. Margaret heard herself gasp, the sound loud in the quiet parking lot. "What is this?" she managed to ask, her eyes still locked on the mirror's surface. "Is this real? Is he still?" "Look closer," the old woman said softly. "Look at what he is doing. Look at what he has been doing all along." Margaret focused her attention, leaning closer to the frame, and she saw that the translucent Thomas was moving in tandem with his grieving wife, mirroring her movements, his hand hovering near hers when she reached for things, his lips moving silently when she spoke aloud to the empty house. He was there, she realized with a shock that went through her like electricity. He had been there all along, in the kitchen when she made coffee she did not drink, in the bedroom when she lay awake at 3 in the morning, in the car when she drove aimlessly through the city, trying to escape the weight of his absence. He had not left. He could not leave. He was bound to her by something stronger than death, some thread that connected them across the boundary that was supposed to be absolute. The scene shifted again, faster now, showing her moment after moment. Thomas sitting beside her in the support group she had attended twice before giving up, his translucent form reaching for her hand as she cried. Thomas in the grocery store, walking beside her down aisles where she forgot what she needed and bought things at random just to fill the cart. Thomas in the passenger seat of her car on this very drive, looking at her with an expression of such profound sadness it nearly broke her. He was mourning too, she realized. He was grieving the loss of their life together, just as she was trapped in this in-between state, able to witness but not to touch, to see but not to be seen, to love but not to be received. "Why can't I see him?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Why?" "Because most people are not meant to see," the old man said, his voice heavy with something that might have been sorrow or might have been simple truth. The living world and the world beyond are separated by a veil that serves a purpose. To see through it, to know what waits on the other side while still walking on this side, would drive most people mad. They would lose the ability to function, to continue, to accept what must be accepted. But some people, rare people, are capable of bearing the knowledge, and those people find their way to us. Or perhaps we find our way to them. The mechanism is not entirely clear, even to us after all this time. Margaret tore her eyes from the mirror to look at the elderly couple, seeing them clearly for the first time. They were old, yes, but their age was wrong somehow, too deep, too complete. They looked like people who had been alive for centuries, who had walked through epochs, who had seen empires rise and crumble and rise again. "Who are you?" she whispered. "What are you?" "We are holders," the woman said simply. "We hold the mirror because it must be held. We show the in-between because it must be seen by those few who are ready to see it. We have held it for longer than your country has existed, longer than the language you speak has been spoken. We will hold it until we are released, and then others will take our place, and the mirror will continue to show what it has always shown, the truth that exists beneath the comfortable lies the world tells itself about death and endings." "I don't understand," Margaret said, though part of her did understand. Part of her had always understood that death was not the clean break the world pretended it was, that the people we loved left echoes and impressions, shadows that persisted even when the body failed. "You don't need to understand everything," the old man said. "You only need to understand enough to make a choice. Because that is why we are here, why you stopped at this rest stop on this particular afternoon. You must choose, Margaret, and you must choose now, because the moment is fleeting, and once it passes, it may not return in your lifetime. Choose what? she asked, though she already knew, could feel the shape of the choice forming in the space between them, heavy and final. Whether to see or to remain blind, the woman said. The mirror has shown you what others cannot perceive, that Thomas has not left you, that he remains bound to this world through love and grief and the unfinished nature of your separation. You can return to your life with this knowledge, seeing him always at the edge of your vision, a constant companion in your loneliness. You will never be alone again, but you will also never be free of the sight of his suffering, of his inability to move forward, because you cannot move forward. Or, she paused, and the weight of that pause pressed down on Margaret like a physical force. Or you can forget. We can take this knowledge back. You will return to your car with no memory of this encounter, no memory of what the mirror revealed. Thomas will remain invisible to you, as he is to everyone else. You will grieve in the normal way, at the normal pace, and eventually the wound will scar over. It will never fully heal, but you will learn to live with it, to build a life that incorporates the absence rather than centering it. He will eventually be able to let go, to move to whatever comes next, because you will have let go first. It is the kinder choice, perhaps, the choice that frees you both. Margaret looked back at the mirror, and the image had changed again. Now she saw two paths branching from this moment, diverging into separate futures. In one path, she walked through her life, seeing Thomas always at her shoulder, his translucent form a constant presence. She saw herself talking to him, responding to him, moving through the world half living and half dwelling in the space between life and death. She saw years passing this way, saw herself growing older, but never fully returning to the realm of the living, always straddling two worlds, belonging fully to neither. But she also saw the comfort of it, the way loneliness dissolved when he was visible, the way she could say, "I love you," and know he heard it, even if he could not respond in ways others would perceive. In the other path, she saw herself driving away from this rest stop with no memory of the mirror, no memory of the choice. She saw herself crying in her car as she had cried for months, but she also saw the tears eventually slowing, saw her gradually returning to the world of the living. She saw her laugh again, first hesitantly, then more freely. She saw her meet new people, form new connections, build a life that honored Thomas's memory without being imprisoned by it. She saw her grow old in a different way, scarred but whole, marked by loss but not defined by it. And in this path, she saw Thomas's translucent form growing fainter, gradually releasing its hold on the physical world, moving towards something she could not see but sense was peaceful, was rest, was the letting go that death was supposed to allow. "How long do I have to decide?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "The sun will set in 4 hours," the old man said. "When the last light leaves the sky today, the moment will close. But decide now if you can. Some choices grow more difficult the longer we contemplate them." Margaret stood in the cold wind, feeling it cut through her jacket, feeling the late afternoon pressing against her like a physical weight. Every instinct in her body screamed to choose sight, to choose the path where she would never have to lose Thomas completely, where his presence would remain tangible even if only to her eyes. What did she care if others thought her mad, if they saw her talking to empty air and judged her? Let them judge. Let them think whatever they wanted. They had not loved him, had not built 37 years of shared history with him, had not woken beside him on 10,000 mornings and thought, "This is my person, this is my home." But even as that instinct rose in her chest, another voice spoke beneath it, quieter but more persistent. She thought of the Thomas she had seen in the mirror, his translucent form always hovering, always watching, his face etched with a sadness that matched her own. She thought of what the old woman had said, that he could not move forward because she could not move forward, that they were locked together in grief, bound by love that had become a cage. Was that what love was supposed to do? Was it supposed to trap the beloved even beyond death, force them to linger in a half-existence, because the living could not bear to let go? Thomas would not have wanted that. She knew with sudden clarity. Thomas, who had loved life so fiercely, who had photographed sunsets and laughed at terrible jokes, and insisted on dancing in the kitchen, even when they were too tired, even when there was no music playing. Thomas, who had squeezed every drop of joy from his time on earth, and would have wanted the same for her. He would not have wanted to become a ghost haunting the edges of her vision, a specter of what had been. He would have wanted her to live fully, to honor what they had shared by continuing to embrace the world with both hands, even though his hands were no longer there to hold. But knowing what he would have wanted and being able to choose it were two different things. The thought of driving away from this rest stop, of returning to her empty house with no memory of this moment, of continuing to grieve without the knowledge that he was still present in some form. It felt like losing him again, a second death that she would have to survive without even understanding why it hurt so much. "Can I speak to him?" Margaret asked suddenly, looking up at the elderly couple. "If I choose to see, will he be able to hear me? Will we be able to communicate?" The woman's expression softened with something that looked like pity. You could speak, and he would hear, but he could not answer, not in ways you would understand. The veil allows seeing, but not true communication. You would have proximity without connection, presence without conversation. You would be together, but separate always. It will be a kind of torture for you both, perhaps, a closeness that only emphasized the distance. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks unchecked. She had not cried in weeks, had thought herself cried out, dried up, empty of tears. But apparently, there were more, always more, an inexhaustible reservoir of salt water that her body produced to match her grief. "This is an impossible choice," she said. "How am I supposed to decide this?" "All the most important choices are impossible," the old man said, and there was surprising gentleness in his ancient voice. "If they were easy, they would not be choices at all, merely obvious paths. The difficulty is part of what makes them sacred. The weight is part of what makes them real." Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the mirror again, watching the two paths continue to play out, to show her the consequences of each decision. She saw herself in the first path, attending a support group session, sitting in a circle of folding chairs. And when someone asked how she was coping, she saw herself smile and say, "I'm doing better," even as Thomas's translucent form sat in the empty chair beside her, unseen by everyone else. She saw the split in her attention, the way she would always be partially elsewhere, partially with him, never fully present in any moment because half of her awareness would be tracking his ghostly presence. She saw relationships she might have formed withering before they began, because how could she connect with the living when the dead occupied so much of her attention? In the second path, she saw herself at the same support group, but different. She saw herself crying genuinely, grieving genuinely, and then eventually, slowly beginning to heal genuinely. She saw her meet a woman named Patricia who became a friend, who understood loss because she had lost her own husband 3 years earlier and had survived it. She saw herself joining Patricia for coffee, then for walks, then for trips to museums and bookstores, gradually reconstructing a life that had meaning even in Thomas's absence. She saw herself visit Thomas's grave on his birthday and their anniversary, saw herself talk to the headstone and feel a sense of connection that was different from the connection of seeing him. More distant perhaps, but also cleaner, less tormented. And in that second path, she saw Thomas's translucent form growing fainter, less defined, until one day it was simply gone, released into whatever came next. And she saw herself feel that release like a weight lifting, like a knot untying, even though she could not remember what she had forgotten, could not recall this moment at the rest stop or the choice she had made. "If I choose to forget," Margaret said slowly, "will he know? Will he understand why I made that choice?" The dead understand more than the living give them credit for, the woman said. Love does not make us stupid. It makes us wise in ways that have nothing to do with reason. He will understand, and he will be grateful in time. The living are not meant to see the dead, Margaret. The separation is a mercy, though it does not feel that way when we are drowning in loss. Margaret looked at the elderly couple, really looked at them, and she saw the cost written in every line of their faces. They had been holding this mirror for centuries. They had said, showing people truths they were not meant to see, bearing witness to choices like the one she was making now. How many people had stood where she was standing? How many had chosen sight? And how many had chosen mercy? And what had become of them? Those who chose to see the dead walking among the living. You've seen this before, she said. You know what I should choose. We know what most people choose, the old man said carefully. But we cannot tell you what you should choose. Each person's path is their own. Some have chosen sight and found in it a kind of peace, a comfort that sustained them. Others have chosen it and been destroyed by it, lost to madness or despair. And some have chosen forgetting and thrived, while others have chosen it and spent the rest of their lives feeling an inexplicable emptiness, a sense that something crucial was missing even though they could not remember what. There is no right answer. There is only your answer, the one that emerges from who you are and what you can bear to carry. Margaret thought of her mother, dead 15 years now, and how in the months after her passing, Margaret had sometimes sensed her presence, had sometimes smelled her perfume in rooms where no one wore perfume, had sometimes felt a hand on her shoulder when she was alone. She had dismissed these moments as grief playing tricks, as her mind conjuring comfort where there was none. But what if it had been real? What if her mother had lingered, invisible and unacknowledged, until Margaret's grief had released enough to let her go? The thought made her stomach clench. How many ghosts walked beside the living, unseen and unrecognized, waiting for permission to leave? Does everyone leave behind a ghost? She asked. Everyone who dies, do they all linger like this? Not everyone, the woman said. Only those whose connections to the living are strong enough, whose unfinished business is profound enough. Most pass through the veil cleanly, moving on to whatever awaits without looking back. But some are held by love, or by guilt, or by promises unkept. And those are the ones who linger in the in-between, visible to us who hold the mirror, invisible to nearly everyone else. For how long? Margaret asked. If I choose to forget, if I let him go, how long will it take for him to move on? There is no way to know, the old man said. Time works differently in the in-between. For some, it is days. For others, years. But eventually, all things pass. All ghosts fade. All grief loosens its grip. It is the nature of existence that nothing lasts forever, not joy and not sorrow. Everything flows, everything changes, everything eventually returns to the source from which it came. Margaret felt something shift inside her, a clarity emerging from the fog of her confusion. She thought of Thomas in their kitchen, laughing as he cooked dinner, singing off-key to the radio. She thought of Thomas in their bed, his body curled around hers, his breath warm against the back of her neck. She thought of Thomas at his desk at work, surrounded by papers and coffee cups, absorbed in whatever problem he was solving, his mind sharp and focused and alive. She thought of all the versions of Thomas she had known and loved, and she realized that none of those versions would want to be reduced to a translucent shadow, a permanent specter hovering at the edge of her life. He had been so vital, so present, so wholly himself. To see him diminished to a ghost would not be comfort. It would be another form of loss, perhaps even crueler than his death. I want to choose to forget, Margaret said, and as soon as the words left her mouth, she knew they were right, knew they were true. I want to let him go. I want to set us both free. The old woman smiled, and in that smile, Margaret saw approval and sadness mingled together. That is the choice of love, she said softly. The hard choice, The brave choice, the choice that costs you everything and gives you everything at the same time. What happens now? Margaret asked, feeling her heart begin to race, feeling panic rising because once this was done, it could not be undone. She would never remember this conversation, would never know what she had seen in the mirror, would spend the rest of her life not understanding why grief was slightly more bearable than it should have been, why Thomas's absence felt like something she could survive rather than something that would destroy her. Now we take the mirror away, the old man said, and you will forget. Not just this conversation, but the heaviness that has been crushing you. The weight of seeing what you should not see, of sensing Thomas's presence, even when you could not name what you were sensing. All of that will lift. You will grieve, yes. The loss is real, and the pain is real, and those cannot be erased. But you will grieve cleanly, without the confusion of sensing something you cannot understand. And Thomas will be freed to move forward, to complete whatever journey he needs to complete. It is a gift you are giving him, though you will not remember giving it. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the wind on her face, feeling the cold air fill her lungs. She thought of Thomas one last time, tried to hold his face in her mind with perfect clarity. The small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the silver that had gradually replaced the brown in his hair. She tried to memorize him, tried to tattoo his image onto the inside of her skull, so that forgetting would be impossible. But even as she thought this, she felt the memories beginning to soften, beginning to blur at the edges. She felt the mirror working its strange magic, felt knowledge being lifted from her mind like a book being closed, a door being shut. She wanted to open her eyes, wanted to stop the process, wanted to cling to what she was about to lose. But the old woman's voice reached her through the growing fog, gentle and firm. Let go, Margaret. Let go of what you cannot carry. Trust that some forgetting is mercy. Trust that love survives even when memory fails. And Margaret, standing in the cold wind with her eyes closed, decided to trust. She let go of her grip on the knowledge, on the seeing, on the desperate hope that she could keep Thomas with her by sheer force of will. She felt it all sliding away, felt herself becoming lighter, felt the terrible weight she had been carrying for 8 months begin to lift. The last thing she was conscious of was a sense of warmth, as if someone had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, as if invisible hands were holding her steady while the world reorganized itself into a new shape, a new truth, a new way of being that did not require her to carry impossibilities. And then there was nothing but darkness and the sound of wind and the distant call of a bird she could not name. Margaret opened her eyes and found herself standing in a rest stop parking lot, feeling disoriented and unsure why she had gotten out of her car. The sun was lower in the sky than she remembered, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, and the temperature had dropped enough that she pulled her jacket tighter around herself. Her back ached, and she had a vague sense that she had been driving for too long, that she should probably turn around and head home before it got dark. But why had she stopped here? She looked around, seeing only empty picnic tables and the cinder-block bathroom and the woods at the far end of the lot, bare trees swaying in the wind. There was no one else here. The parking lot was empty except for her car. She must have stopped to use the bathroom or stretch her legs, though she had no specific memory of either action. The haziness bothered her, made her wonder if she was more tired than she realized, if the grief had been affecting her concentration more than she wanted to admit. She had been driving aimlessly, she remembered that much, tried to escape the emptiness of the house, trying to pretend that movement was the same thing as progress. But standing here in this desolate rest stop, feeling the cold seep into her bones, she recognized the futility of it. Running away did not work when the thing you were running from lived inside your own heart. Margaret walked back to her car, feeling each step as a small effort, feeling the weight of 8 months of grief pressing down on her shoulders. But there was something different about the weight now, she realized as she opened the driver's side door and slid behind the wheel. It felt more manageable somehow, more like a heavy backpack she had learned to carry rather than an anchor dragging her to the bottom of an ocean. She still missed Thomas with an intensity that made her chest ache, still felt his absence like a missing limb. But the grief felt cleaner now, more straightforward. It felt like something she could survive rather than something that would destroy her. She started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, pointing the car back in the direction she had come, toward home. The highway stretched before her, gray asphalt under gray sky, and she found herself thinking about the future in a way she had not allowed herself to think about it since Thomas died. What would next year look like? What would she do with the house that was too large for one person? Would she sell it, move somewhere smaller, somewhere that did not echo with 37 years of shared life? Or would she find a way to make it hers alone, to create new memories that did not center around absence? The questions did not have answers yet, but for the first time, she felt capable of asking them without falling apart. That was something. That was progress, however small. As she drove, Margaret noticed things she had not noticed on the way out. A barn with a collapsed roof that looked beautiful in its decay, the way the bare trees created intricate patterns against the sky, the particular quality of late afternoon light that Thomas had loved and she had never quite understood. But she thought she might be beginning to understand it now. The way the light was most beautiful when it was leaving, when it was saying goodbye. There was something about endings that made things precious, she realized. It was the brevity that created value, the knowledge that nothing lasted forever that made each moment shimmer with significance. She thought of Thomas without the usual crushing wave of despair, thought of him instead with a kind of tender sadness that felt almost sweet. She remembered the good things, his laugh, his terrible puns, the way he had made her coffee every morning for 37 years, always remembering exactly how she liked it even when they were running late. She remembered the big things too, the way he had held her hand through her mother's funeral, the way he had supported her when she wanted to go back to school, the way he had loved her not despite her flaws, but with them, as part of the complete package of who she was. These memories still hurt, but they also reminded her of how fortunate she had been, how rare it was to be loved so completely, to share so many years with someone who truly saw you and chose you anyway, every single day. The sky darkened as she drove, clouds thickening, and Margaret turned on her headlights, even though full night was still an hour away. She passed a church with a lit sign that read, "All are welcome," and on impulse, she pulled into the parking lot, not sure what she was doing or why. The building was small and white, traditional in its architecture, with a tall steeple and stained glass windows that glowed warmly from within. Margaret sat in her car for a moment, engine running, debating whether to go inside or continue home. She was not particularly religious, had not attended church regularly since childhood, but something about the warmth of those lit windows called to her, suggested refuge, suggested community. She turned off the engine and walked up the steps, pushing open the heavy wooden door. The interior was empty except for a woman arranging flowers at the altar, humming softly to herself. The woman looked up as Margaret entered, and her face broke into a warm smile. "Good evening," she said. "Are you here for the grief support group? It starts in about 10 minutes. Margaret almost said no, almost turned around and left, but something stopped her. "I didn't know there was a group," she said. "I was just driving by." "Well, you're here now," the woman said, setting down her flowers and wiping her hands on her jeans. "That's what matters. We meet every Wednesday. Small group, usually just 5 or 6 of us, but we've been helping each other through some very difficult times. You're welcome to join us, or you're welcome to just sit in the sanctuary for a while if you need quiet. Whatever feels right." Margaret considered this. Another grief support group, another circle of folding chairs, another round of introducing herself as a widow and watching people's faces shift into expressions of sympathy. She had sworn she was done with support groups. done with shared grief and well-meaning strangers. But standing in this warm church with its smell of flowers and wood polish, with this kind-faced woman looking at her without pity, just simple human recognition, she found herself saying yes. "I think I'll stay," she said. "Thank you." The woman smiled. "I'm Patricia," she said. "My husband died 3 years ago. Heart attack. He was 52, healthy as far as we knew. One day he was here, the next day he wasn't. So I understand what you're carrying, even if I don't know your specific story." The weight is familiar. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were different from the tears she had been crying for months. These were not tears of desperation or despair, but something gentler, something that acknowledged pain without being consumed by it. "I'm Margaret," she said. "My husband was Thomas. 8 months ago. Aneurysm." "Too soon," Patricia said softly. "Too sudden. That's the hardest kind, I think. No time to prepare, no time to say goodbye. Just there, and then not there, leaving you to make sense of an absence that makes no sense at all." "Yes," Margaret said, and the simple acknowledgement felt like relief. Someone who understood, someone who had walked this path and survived it, someone who could testify that survival was possible. Other people began arriving. An older man who had lost his wife to cancer, a younger woman whose husband had died in a car accident, a middle-aged man whose partner had committed suicide. They arranged their folding chairs in a circle, and Margaret took a seat, feeling simultaneously exposed and strangely safe. These people were strangers, but they were also fellow travelers, all of them navigating the terrible country of grief, trying to find their way back to something resembling life. They went around the circle, sharing where they were in their process, what the week had been like, what small victories or defeats they had experienced. Margaret listened, recognizing her own story in theirs, seeing her own pain reflected in different circumstances, different details, but the same fundamental truth, that love made you vulnerable, that connection created the possibility of devastating loss, and that somehow, impossibly, people survived it. They survived and eventually, slowly, built new lives that incorporated the loss without being defined by it. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she found words coming more easily than she expected. She talked about the emptiness of the house, about avoiding mirrors and photographs, about driving aimlessly because staying still felt like drowning. She talked about the guilt of laughing at something and then immediately feeling like she had betrayed Thomas's memory by experiencing a moment of lightness. She talked about the exhaustion of grief, the way it took all her energy just to get through each day, leaving nothing for anything resembling a future. And the group listened without trying to fix her, without offering platitudes or timelines, just holding space for her pain the way they held space for each other's pain. Patricia reached over and squeezed her hand when Margaret's voice broke, and the touch was both simple and profound. Human connection, person to person, hand to hand, acknowledging that we are all fragile, all capable of being shattered, all in need of support to keep standing. After the meeting ended, Patricia invited Margaret for coffee. They went to a small diner down the street, sitting in a booth by the window, and talked for 2 hours. Patricia was a retired teacher, her children grown and living in other states, her life reorganized around the fact of her husband's absence, but not destroyed by it. She had found ways to fill her days, volunteering at the library, taking watercolor classes, traveling to places she and her husband had always planned to visit together. "At first I felt guilty about every good thing," Patricia said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Like I was betraying him by continuing to live when he couldn't. But I realized eventually that the best way to honor what we had was to keep living fully, to not waste the time I have. He would have wanted that. He loved life too much to want me to stop living just because he was gone." Margaret found herself nodding, recognizing a truth she had been circling but had not quite been able to articulate. Thomas would have wanted her to live. He would have wanted her to find joy again, to build a life that meant something, to not let his death become the defining fact of her existence. Knowing that and being able to do it were still two different things, but the knowledge was a start. The knowledge was permission. They exchanged phone numbers before parting, and Patricia hugged her, a real hug that lasted longer than the polite hugs of acquaintances. "Call me anytime," Patricia said. 3 in the morning, middle of the day, whenever. "We who understand this particular hell have to look out for each other." "Deal. Deal." Margaret agreed, and meant it. Driving home in the full darkness now, Margaret felt something she had not felt in 8 months. Hope. Not happiness. Not yet, maybe not for a long time. But hope. The sense that survival was possible, that life on the other side of this loss might contain meaning, might contain connection, might contain moments of lightness that would not feel like betrayal. She thought of Thomas, and the thought was still painful, but it was a pain she could hold now, a pain that had boundaries rather than consuming her entire being. When she pulled into her driveway, the house looked less intimidating than it had when she left that morning. It was still too large, still too empty, still full of reminders. But it was also her home, the place where she and Thomas had built their life together, and that meant something. That was valuable. Maybe she would not sell it after all. Maybe she would learn to live in it alone, to create new memories that honored the old ones without being imprisoned by them. Inside, Margaret moved through the familiar rooms with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were seeing them for the first time. The living room, with its worn couch where they had watched countless movies, arguing good-naturedly about plot holes and character motivations. The kitchen where Thomas had experimented with recipes, some successes and some disasters, all of them made with enthusiasm. The bedroom where they had slept side by side for so many years, where they had comforted each other through nightmares and illness, where they had made love and made plans and simply existed together in comfortable silence. She paused in the doorway of Thomas's study, a small room he had claimed as his own space, lined with bookshelves and dominated by the desk, where he had worked on projects and paid bills and sorted through the administrative details of life. Margaret had not entered this room since his death, had kept the door closed as if sealing off a tomb. But tonight, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of him still, cologne and coffee, and the particular scent that was just him, indefinable and irreplaceable. His reading glasses sat on the desk, exactly where he had left them, folded beside a book he had been in the middle of reading. Margaret picked up the book, seeing the bookmark about halfway through, and felt a familiar ache. He had not finished this story. He would never finish it. There were so many things he would never finish, never experience, never know. It was one of the cruelest aspects of sudden death. Not just the ending, but the incompleteness, all the threads left hanging, all the sentences left unfinished. But as Margaret stood in the study, holding Thomas's book, she realized that incompleteness was actually the natural state of life. No one finished everything. No one tied up every thread. Even people who lived to 100 died with projects incomplete, conversations unfinished, dreams unrealized. That was simply the condition of being human. We began things we would not complete. We made plans that would not come to fruition. We loved people we would eventually lose or be lost to. Accepting that incompleteness was perhaps part of accepting death itself. Accepting that there was no version of life where everything was resolved, where every story had a proper ending. She set the book back on the desk and moved to the window, looking out at the backyard, dark now except for the ambient light from the neighbors' houses. Thomas had been planning to build a deck that spring, had drawn up sketches and priced out materials, excited about the project in a way he had not been excited about anything work-related in years. The deck would never be built now, but that was all right. The absence of a deck was not the tragedy. The tragedy was the absence of Thomas himself, his laughter and his dreams and his presence. Everything else was just details. Margaret turned away from the window and began to go through the desk drawers, not with any particular goal, but simply to engage with Thomas's belongings, to touch things he had touched, to acknowledge that he had existed and left traces. She found old receipts and warranties for appliances they no longer owned, photographs from trips they had taken, a birthday card she had given him 5 years ago that he had apparently kept. The card made her cry, not with the overwhelming despair of the past months, but with a sadness that was clean and finite, a grief that had a beginning and middle and would eventually, she believed, have something resembling an end. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old tax returns, she found a notebook she did not recognize. The cover was plain brown leather, worn with handling, and when she opened it, she discovered Thomas's handwriting, pages and pages of it, entries that went back years. A journal. She had not known he kept a journal. Margaret carried the notebook to the desk chair and sat down, turning to the first page. The entry was dated 12 years ago, and it was about a conversation they had had about whether to have children. They had ultimately decided against it, both of them feeling ambivalent, both of them recognizing that the life they had built together felt complete without that addition. But reading Thomas's entry now, Margaret saw doubt she had not perceived at the time, questions he had never voiced aloud. "I wonder sometimes if I'm being selfish," he had written, "if I'm choosing comfort over purpose. Margaret says she's fine either way. But what if she's just agreeing with me because she thinks it's what I want? What if we regret this in 20 years, when it's too late to change course?" Margaret felt a pang of recognition. She had wondered the same things in her own private moments, had also worried about future regret. But they had never quite managed to articulate these fears to each other, had instead presented unified fronts, agreeing easily when perhaps they should have struggled more, questioned more, been more honest about their uncertainties. That was a small failure of their marriage, she realized. Not a fatal one, not something that had destroyed what they built, but a limitation nonetheless. They had been so good at being partners, at supporting each other, at presenting a united front to the world, that sometimes they had forgotten to be vulnerable with each other, to show the cracks and doubts and fears. She turned pages, reading entries that spanned years. Thomas wrote about his frustrations at work, his sense that he had compromised too much, given up too many dreams in service of financial stability. He wrote about his love for her, expressing it in words he had never quite managed to say aloud, poetry and passion hiding beneath his practical exterior. He wrote about his fears of aging, of death, of leaving her alone. "If I die first," one entry read, "I hope Margaret doesn't spend too long mourning. I hope she finds a way to be happy again. She deserves happiness. She deserves a life that continues even if I'm not in it." Margaret stopped reading, setting the journal down on the desk, feeling tears stream down her face. But these tears were different from all the tears she had cried before. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of understanding. Thomas had worried about her. Thomas had wanted her to survive his death, to thrive after it. He had given her permission, even if he had only written it in a journal she would not find until after he was gone. The permission had been there all along, waiting for her to be ready to receive it. She thought of the support group, of Patricia's words about honoring the dead by living fully. She thought of the future stretching ahead of her, no longer empty, but full of possibility. She thought of all the things she might do, the way she might grow, the person she might become. Not a replacement for who she had been when Thomas was alive, but an evolution, a continuation, a woman shaped by loss but not destroyed by it. Margaret closed the journal and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of it, the weight of Thomas's interior life that she had not fully known, that no one ever fully knows about another person. We live alongside each other. We love each other. We build lives together. But we remain in some essential way separate, individual, alone in our own heads with our own thoughts and fears and dreams. That was not a failure of love. That was simply the condition of being human. We could never fully know another person, never fully merge, never completely dissolve the boundary between self and other. But we could love anyway. We could connect anyway. We could build something meaningful in the space between our separate selves, something that honored both our togetherness and our fundamental aloneness. She stood and carried the journal to the bedroom, setting it on her nightstand. She would read more of it, but not tonight. Tonight she needed a rest. Tomorrow would be difficult, as all the tomorrows since Thomas's death had been difficult. But she sensed that the quality of the difficulty was changing, was becoming something she could work with rather than something that simply crushed her. The grief would continue, but it would not consume her. The sadness would remain, but it would not be her entire existence. She could hold both, the loss and the life, the absence and the presence, the ending and the continuation. Margaret changed into her nightgown and brushed her teeth, performing the rituals of evening with something approaching normalcy. She got into bed, instinctively moving to her usual side, leaving the right side empty. But tonight, instead of feeling the emptiness as a wound, she felt it as a fact, neutral and unchangeable. Thomas was not there. Thomas would never be there again. And that was terrible, and that was true, and she would survive it anyway. As she lay in the darkness, waiting for sleep, Margaret thought she felt something, a warmth, a presence, a sense of being watched over. Not in a frightening way, but in a comforting way, as if someone stood guard while she rested. She did not try to rationalize it or explain it or decide whether it was real or imagined. She simply felt it, let it comfort her, let it ease her into sleep. Whether it was Thomas's spirit or her own subconscious providing solace, or simply the residue of the support group's warmth, it did not matter. What mattered was that she did not feel entirely alone, that something in the universe seemed to be suggesting she was held, she was seen, she was capable of surviving this. And for the first time in 8 months, Margaret slept through the night without waking, without nightmares, without the 3 a.m. panic that had become her constant companion. She slept deeply and dreamlessly, her body finally relaxing its vigilant grip, finally trusting that morning would come and she would still be here, still breathing, still capable of continuing. The healing would take time, months or years, an unknowable distance. But it had begun, she realized as she drifted into darkness. Whatever had happened at that rest stop, whatever strange encounter she could not quite remember, it had shifted something inside her, had loosened the knot of grief just enough to let a little light through. And light, even a little light, was enough to find your way forward, one step at a time, one day at a time, until eventually the path became visible again, and walking felt less like survival and more like living. 3 months after the night, she found Thomas's journal. Margaret sat in Patricia's kitchen drinking tea and talking about the future. They had become close friends in the weeks following that first support group meeting, speaking almost daily, taking walks together, sharing meals and memories, and the particular intimacy that exists between people who have survived similar devastation. Patricia had become Margaret's witness, the person who understood without explanation, who could sit in silence when words failed, and who knew exactly when to push and when to simply be present. "I've been thinking about selling the house," Margaret said, watching steam rise from her cup. "Not because I can't bear to be there anymore. I'm past that, I think. But because it feels like I'm living in a museum. Everything is preserved exactly as it was when Thomas was alive. His clothes still in the closet, his shampoo still in the shower. I haven't changed anything, and I think maybe I need to. Maybe I need to make it mine, not ours." Patricia nodded, understanding flickering in her expression. "I went through that too. After Jim died, I kept his side of the bed made, his slippers by the door, like he might come home at any moment. It took me almost a year to pack up his things, and when I finally did, I felt both relieved and guilty. Relieved that I could finally breathe without the constant reminders, guilty that I was erasing evidence of his existence." "How did you decide what to keep?" Margaret asked. "I kept things that felt like love," Patricia said slowly. "Not the big things, mostly. Not his suits or his watch or the expensive items. I kept a shirt he wore all the time that still smelled like him. I kept the coffee mug he used every morning. I kept photographs, of course, but I put them in an album instead of leaving them scattered around the house like shrines. I kept his wedding ring and his copy of our favorite book. Things that felt essential, that contained something of who he was. Everything else I gave away or donated. And once I did that, once I made the space mine again, I could finally start imagining what came next. Margaret considered this. She had thought about Thomas's belongings countless times, had opened his closet and closed it again without touching anything, unable to cross that threshold. But maybe it was time. Maybe holding on to physical objects was not the same as holding on to love, to memory, to the importance of what they had shared. "There's something else," Margaret said, setting down her tea. "Something I've been wanting to tell you, but I wasn't sure how to explain it. About 3 months ago, the day before I came to the support group for the first time, something happened. Or I think something happened. I drove out of the city, stopped at a rest stop, and then I drove back. But there's this gap in my memory. I can't remember why I stopped or how long I was there. It's like a piece of time is just missing. And ever since then, grief has felt different, more manageable, like something shifted, but I can't remember what." Patricia looked at her with those kind, knowing eyes. Maybe it doesn't matter what happened. Maybe what matters is that something did happen, something that helped you begin healing. The brain does strange things with trauma. Margaret, it protects us in ways we don't always understand. Maybe you needed to forget something in order to survive it. Maybe, Margaret agreed, but the missing time still bothered her, still pulled at her attention like a loose thread she wanted to follow to its source. She had driven past that rest stop twice since then, looking for something that might trigger her memory, a landmark, a sign, anything that would explain the gap. But nothing had surfaced, and she was left with just the sense that something significant had occurred in those lost hours, something that had changed her trajectory without her fully understanding how. The conversation moved on to other topics: Patricia's upcoming trip to visit her daughter, Margaret's tentative plans to return to painting, a hobby she had abandoned decades ago when life got busy. They talked until the afternoon light began to fade, until Margaret realized she should head home before dark. But as she was leaving, Patricia stopped her at the door with a hand on her arm. "I'm proud of you," Patricia said simply, "for doing the work, for choosing to keep living even when it would be easier to just exist. Thomas would be proud too." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, grateful tears. "Thank you," she said, "for being my friend, for understanding. We understand each other," Patricia corrected gently. "That's what makes this work." Driving home, Margaret thought about understanding, about the different kinds of knowing that existed in the world. She understood Patricia's grief, even though the circumstances were different. Patricia understood hers, even though their husbands had been different people. There was a universal language to loss. She had learned, a commonality that transcended the specific details. Everyone's grief was unique, but everyone's grief was also fundamentally the same: the absence of someone you loved, the hole torn in the fabric of your life, the necessity of learning to live with that hole instead of constantly falling through it. When she got home, instead of avoiding Thomas's study, as she usually did, Margaret went directly there. She opened the closet where his clothes hung and began taking them out, one item at a time, making 3 piles: keep, donate, uncertain. It was harder than she expected, each piece of clothing carrying memories, carrying his essence. But she worked through it methodically, trusting her initial instincts, not overthinking. The brown leather jacket stayed. Most of his suits went in the donate pile. His favorite sweater, the soft blue one he wore every weekend, stayed. By the time she finished, the key pile was small, but meaningful: 6 or 7 items that felt essential, that she could imagine touching on hard days, that connected her to who he had been without trying to pretend he was still there. She did the same with his books, his papers, his collections of small objects. She was not erasing him, she realized as she worked. She was curating him, distilling his presence down to its essence instead of letting it sprawl across every surface. And in the process, she was making room for herself, for her own life going forward, for the person she was becoming in the absence of him. As she was sorting through the papers on his desk, Margaret found an envelope addressed to her in Thomas's handwriting. Her heart lurched. How'd she missed this before? She turned it over, seeing it had never been opened, though it had clearly been sealed. With shaking hands, she slid her finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The letter was dated 2 weeks before his death. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for leaving you, even though I know death isn't really a choice. I'm sorry for all the conversations we didn't have, all the things I should have said and didn't. But most of all, I'm sorry if my dying makes you forget how to live. Because, my love, you were always the one who knew how to live. I was the cautious one, the practical one, the one who played it safe. You were the brave one, even when you didn't feel brave. You were the one who took risks, who felt deeply, who loved without reservation. Don't let losing me make you lose that. Don't let grief make you small and scared. I want you to paint again. I want you to travel to all the places we never got to. I want you to laugh until you cry and dance like no one's watching and fall in love again if that's what you want. I want you to live a life so big and so beautiful that when we meet again, if there isn't again, you'll have stories to tell me that will make me jealous I miss them. That's my final wish, my final request. Live for both of us. Live like you mean it. With all my love, always Thomas." Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs that were grief and relief and gratitude all mixed together. He had known. Somehow, on some level, he had known he needed to tell her this, needed to give her permission, needed to release her from any obligation to diminish herself in his memory. The letter was a gift, the most profound gift he could have given her. Permission to continue, to grow, to become someone new. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her nightstand, next to his journal. These would be her touchstones, the things she would return to when doubt crept in, when grief threatened to pull her back into its undertow. Thomas's words, Thomas's wishes, Thomas's love expressed not as chains but as wings. That night, Margaret did something she had not done in almost a year. She went into the garage and pulled out her old art supplies, dusty and neglected. She set up an easel in the living room, facing the window that looked out on the backyard. She squeezed paint onto a palette, selected a brush, and began to paint, not trying to create anything specific, just letting color flow, letting her hands remember the motions they had once known so well. The painting that emerged was abstract, chaotic, full of dark blues and grays but shot through with gold, light breaking through clouds, hope emerging from sorrow, beauty coexisting with pain. She painted until midnight, lost in the work, and when she finally cleaned her brushes and stepped back to look at what she had created, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time: satisfaction, pride, the sense that she had made something, had contributed something to the world instead of just surviving in it. The painting was not for anyone else. It was for her, a marker of this moment, this transition, this choice to continue despite everything. 6 months later, Margaret stood in an art gallery downtown, watching strangers examine her paintings. It was her first show, a small collection of 12 works, all created in the months since she had begun painting again. Each piece dealt with grief in some way, but not the raw, drowning grief of the early months. These paintings explored the complex relationship between loss and continuity, between absence and memory, between the person you were and the person you were becoming. They were not sad paintings, exactly, though sadness threaded through them. They were honest paintings, paintings that refused easy comfort, but also refused to pretend that beauty could not coexist with pain. Patricia stood beside her, sipping wine, beaming with pride. "You should be mingling," Patricia said. "People want to meet the artist. Don't hide in the corner all night." Margaret smiled, feeling nervous but also exhilarated. She had not expected this, had not imagined that reconnecting with painting would lead to this moment, to people actually caring about what she had created. But her art teacher had encouraged her to submit to the gallery's open call, and to Margaret's surprise, the curator had selected her entire series. "They speak to something universal," the curator had said. "Everyone has lost something or someone. Your work makes that loss visible in ways that feel true." As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself engaged in conversations about art and grief and the creative process. People told her their own stories of loss, how her paintings had made them feel seen, had given shape to emotions they had struggled to articulate. An older man told her about losing his son. A young woman spoke about her sister's suicide. A middle-aged couple described the death of their first child decades ago, a wound that had never fully healed but had learned to breathe. Margaret listened to each story, honored to receive them, recognizing that her willingness to make her own grief visible had somehow given others permission to acknowledge theirs. She thought of the future, no longer with dread, but with cautious anticipation. She would continue painting. She would travel, maybe, to some of the places she and Thomas had planned to visit. She would deepen her friendship with Patricia and with the others from the support group who had become her chosen family. She might even, eventually, consider the possibility of loving again, though that still felt distant, still felt like something that belonged to a different version of herself that she had not yet become. But the point was that the future existed. It had shape and possibility. It was not just endless empty days to be survived, but a canvas on which she could create something meaningful. Margaret turned off the light and settled into sleep, and as she drifted into darkness, she felt that sense again, the warmth, the presence, the feeling of being watched over. And this time, instead of wondering what it was or where it came from, she simply accepted it as grace, as the universe's way of confirming that she was on the right path, that she was doing what needed to be done. She was living. She was choosing to continue despite loss. She was honoring Thomas, not by remaining frozen in the moment of his death, but by allowing that death to transform her into someone deeper, more compassionate, more fully human. And in the space between waking and sleeping, in that liminal territory where certainty dissolved and mystery reigned, Margaret thought she heard a voice, familiar and beloved, whispering words she could not quite make out, but whose meaning she understood completely. "I'm proud of you. I love you. Live well." Whether the voice was real or imagined, memory or visitation, did not matter. What mattered was that she believed it, that she carried it forward, that she used it as permission to keep becoming whoever she was meant to become in the long years that remained to her. The weight of grief would never fully lift, she understood now. It would always be there, a permanent part of her internal landscape. But weight was not the same as burden. Weight could be grounding, could be ballast, could be the thing that kept you connected to what mattered most. And Thomas's love, Thomas's memory, Thomas's final wish for her to live boldly. That was weight worth carrying, weight that did not crush but instead anchored her, reminding her constantly of what was possible when two people loved each other completely, reminding her that such love did not end with death, but continued in the living, in the choices they made, in the ways they honored what had been by refusing to let it dictate what could still be. Margaret slept, and somewhere in her dreams, she walked through a landscape she did not recognize, but that felt like coming home. And beside her, sometimes visible and sometimes not, walked a familiar figure, keeping pace, keeping watch, keeping faith that she would find her way through the wilderness of grief into something resembling peace. The journey would take time, years maybe, possibly the rest of her life. But she was on the path. She was moving forward. And that finally was enough.